Welcome to our YouTube channel, dedicated to showcasing the brilliance of chess through analysis of iconic games, featuring in-depth breakdowns of strategic maneuvers, tactical brilliance, and thrilling clashes between chess legends. Let's start the game. Today, witness an intense battle between two formidable players, White R.Rapport 2486 and Black Niclas Huschenbeth 2404 at the Chur 2010 tournament. White starts by advancing the d-pawn 2 squares, aiming to control the center and create opportunities for piece development. Black mirrors this move, establishing a solid pawn structure and contesting the center. White develops the knight to f3, supporting the d4 pawn and preparing for castling kingside. Black mirrors this move, developing the knight to f6, which also supports the d5 pawn and prepares for king safety. White plays c4, striking at the center and initiating the queen's gambit. Black captures the pawn on c4 with the d5 pawn, accepting the gambit and gaining material, but potentially allowing White to gain a lead in development. White moves the knight to b1 from c3 square, reinforcing the central pawn and preparing to bring the other knight into play. Black plays a 6, preventing White's knight from hopping to b5 and preparing to push b-pawn to b5. White advances the e-pawn, aiming to control the center and create space for its pieces. Black responds by advancing the b-pawn, challenging White's central pawn and potentially gaining counterplay on the queen side. White continues to push the e-pawn, aiming to gain space and open lines for its pieces. Black develops the knight to d5, challenging White's central control and preparing to develop the light-squared bishop. White plays a 4, aiming to gain space on the queen side and potentially weaken Black's pawn structure. Black develops the bishop to b7, eyeing the long diagonal and preparing to castle kingside. White advances the e-pawn, aiming to control the center and create space for its pieces, potentially weaken Black's pawn structure. Let's consider Black's pawn move from b5 to b4. White's pawn on the e6 square captures Black's pawn on the f7 square, delivering a check. Black's king retreats to the safe square d7. Now White's knight from f3 jumps to the e5 square, targeting the Black king and delivering a check. If Black's king moves to d6 square, White's knight on c3 jumps to e4, delivering a check to the Black king on d6. Black's king continues to e6 square. White's queen moves from d1 to g4, targeting the Black king with checks. At this square, the Black king is checkmated. So the Black king only retreats to c8 square, a suitable safe square. Now White's queen moves from d1 to g4, delivering a check to the Black king on c8. In response, Black's knight on b8 jumps to d7 square, blocking the check from the White queen, especially on the g4 to c8 diagonal. At that point, White's knight on c3 square is attacked by Black's pawn on b4. White's knight jumps and captures Black's knight on d5 square. In response, Black recaptures the White knight on d5 with his bishop on b7 square. Then, White's light square bishop from f1 jumps and captures Black's pawn on c4 square. In response, Black retakes the White bishop on c4 with the Black bishop on d5 square. Next, White's central knight on e5 beautifully jumps to the c6 square, targeting and forking Black's queen on d8 square. At this point, Black's final strength is evident. Black pushes the pawn from h7 to h5 square, targeting the White queen on g4 square. In response, the White queen moves down from g4 to h3. Simultaneously, Black's king moves from c8 to b7 square. Then, the White knight on c6 finally captures the Black queen on d8. Well, let's go to the primary variation. Black takes the sacrificing pawn on e6 with the f7 pawn accepting the pawn sacrifice, but gaining control over the f-file. White develops the bishop to e2, aiming to control important diagonal squares and prepare for castling. Black captures the knight on c3 with his knight on d5, exchanging pieces and aiming to simplify the position. White recaptures the knight on c3 with the b-pawn, maintaining control of the center and preparing to initiate and develop his pieces. Black develops the queen to d5, aiming to centralize the queen and put pressure on White's position. This sequence of moves demonstrates typical ideas and strategies in the Queen's Gambit accepted opening, with both sides focusing on central control, piece development, and pawn structure. The White Knight's move to g5 serves two strategic objectives. Firstly, it applies pressure on the Black e6 pawn, creating a threat of capture. Secondly, potentially preparing for the advancement of White's e2 bishop to f3. This square becomes a potent attacking point, particularly targeting the Black queen on d5 and the Black bishop on b7, both situated along the h1 to a8 diagonal. Black decided to capture the White pawn on g2 with his queen, with the goal of empowering his queen and causing disturbance in White's kingside pawn structure. With White's king still in the center and unable to castle, this move further complicates White's position. White retreated his rook to the f1 square, placing the Black's bishop on d5 square is the most suitable move as it defends the e6 pawn. However, Black's development of pieces is notably delayed. Black's knight moves to d7 square, then progresses to f6 and finally settles on g4. This positioning enables it to threaten White's pawns on f2 and h2, enhancing its overall influence on the board. The White Knight grabs the e6 pawn, aiming to attack the c7 square and threaten Black's king and rook with forks and checks. Putting the rook on c8 is smart. It stops the opponent from grabbing material with a fork and protects the c7 square. After White's pawn captures on b5, Black responds by retaking with the a6 pawn to b5. This exchange opens up both the file and the diagonal. The a file becomes particularly significant as White prepares to occupy and exert pressure. When White's rook moves to the a7 square, it becomes more effective, especially on the 7th rank, where it can target Black's bishop on b7 and the Black pawn on c7. Black's queen retreats to the c6 square to protect their position. When White's bishop moves from e2 to g4, it becomes a good defensive move, helping out a weak knight on the e6 square. Moreover, bishop to g4 immediately targets Black's knight on d7 along the h3 c8 diagonal. Black decides to move their queen from c6 to b6, attacking the White rook on s7. Black's decision proves to be incorrect or mistaken. Black moves their queen multiple times to d5, capturing on g2, then to c6, and finally to b6. This results in losing a tempo and delaying the development of their pieces. Especially Black's dark square bishop on f8 remains inactive, blocked by White's knight on e6, and Black's own pawns on e7 and g7. Consequently, the bishop is left in a bad and poor position. A better option would have been for Black to move their knight to f6 square, instead of placing the queen on b6. In this way, White could have kept their bishop on g4, perhaps even shifting it to h3 for a more favorable position. The tactical strike starts when the White knight moves from e6 to c5, preparing to attack the Black bishop and knight. Black has two choices: either the knight on d7 captures the White knight on c5, or the Black queen on b6 takes the White rook on a7. Let's consider the first option. The Black knight on d7 captures the White knight on c5. In response, White recaptures the knight on c5 with the pawn on d4 square. In this position, White targets the Black queen on b6 square with the White pawn on c5. Moreover, White controls the d-file and puts pressure on the d7 square. So, Black's queen on b6 captures White's rook on a 7 square. In response, White's bishop from g4 square moves to d7 square, delivering a check to Black's king. If the black king retreats to d8 square, there is no salvation as white's bishop on d7 square moves to c6 square, and delivering a discovered check by the white queen on d1 to the black king on d8 square. This results in a swift defeat. Therefore, the black king retreats to a safer square f7. Now, white's subsequent move involves the queen shifting from d1 square to g4 square. This strategic move threatens to deliver a checkmate to the black king by supporting the white bishop on d7 and targeting the e6 square. Now, black's queen moves from a 7 to a 6, signaling an attempt to reinforce the weak square e6 and strengthen black's position. Now, white's final decisive move is calming. This move involves advancing the white c-pawn to c6 square. This strategic maneuver serves a dual purpose. It either attacks the black bishop on b7 square or seals off the 6th rank, effectively controlling the critical e6 square. So this move puts black in a difficult position. White is poised to deliver checkmate to the black king, targeting the e6 square. So this move puts black in a difficult position. Well, let's go to the primary variation. Black's final ultimate decision is rather mistaken. This move sees black's queen from b6 capturing the white rook on a 7 square. The white bishop takes or captures the black knight on the d7 square. This is nice fork. This fork pieces by creating simultaneously attack. If the black king moves to the f7 square, black would be swiftly lost, facing a horrible attack by white. Let's go to the primary variation. Black's king retreats just 1 square to g8. Now white moves their queen from d1 to h5, giving a check and aiming at black's e8 square. White is threatening to checkmate, win a material. Black's pawn on g7 moves to g6, forcing the opponent's queen to leave the h5 square. White's bishop captures black's pawn on b5, threatening a checkmate with their knight moving from c5 to e6. Black's push of the c-pawn to c6 allows the opponent to win material. Now, white's queen checks at d5. It's a brilliant move, but risky as the queen can be taken. However, it could lead to winning material or checkmate. If black's c6 pawn takes the queen on d5, white's knight lands on e6 for a sleek checkmate. So, the black king only moves to its safe square at c7. Here, white's bishop moves to f4, checking black's king. Black's pawn on e7 blocks at e5. White then captures the e5 pawn with their bishop, checking again. So, black's king has to move to b6. At this point, white's knight moves from c5 to d7, executing a fork and checking black's king. Consequently, black's king has only one safe square to move to, which is a 5. Meanwhile, white's queen captures black's c-pawn, setting up a threat of checkmate, with the queen on c4 to a 4. So, black decides to capture white's bishop on b5 with their c6 pawn. Meanwhile, white moves their dark square bishop from e5 to c7, delivering a check. In response, black captures white's dark square bishop on c7 with their rook from c8. Next, white moves their queen from c4 to a 2, also delivering a check. To counter, black's dark square bishop moves from f8 to a 3, blocking white's check. This move activates black's dark square bishop, which had been inactive until now. In the meantime, white's queen captures black's dark square bishop on a 3 and delivers a check to the black king on a 5. With no more squares to move to, the black king is checkmated, and the game concludes. Thank you for tuning in to my channel and staying updated on my latest content. If you enjoyed it, I'd appreciate your support by subscribing, liking, and sharing my videos across other platforms.